For those of you who like to travel light and take your tackle anywhere, I've got something very special to show you. This is the Agility EXP range of tackle. Wow, that looks like a fishy peg. I'm fishing today at Woodpecker Lake, which is at Aldin Grange fishery near Durham. And we're going to look at waggler fishing, just a very simple approach, but one that hopefully we're going to catch some nice fish. Before I start fishing, I just want to quickly show you a new range of rods that we've developed for Shakespeare. This new range of 4 rods is called Agility EXP, and EXP stands for Expedition. So the thinking behind this range was that when you're struggling for space in the car, maybe if you're going on holiday with the family or if you're going on holiday abroad, we wanted to develop a range of rods that were very practical with good performance, but with a small, compact transport length. So that's the 11-foot pellet waggler rod, and you can see that it's 4-piece, and you can see how short the sections are, and you can see the rod bag I'm using obviously allows me to maximize the space in the car when I'm traveling. And within that range then there's the 11-foot pellet waggler. I've got a 13-foot match rod, which obviously is the most versatile of match rods. You'll be able to use this when you're pleasure fishing on commercials such as this, float fishing on rivers and also on bigger lakes. So that's an extremely versatile rod. I've also got 2 really nice feeder rods in the range. There's a wonderful 11-footer, which has got a nice medium action. So when you're looking at fishing a small feeder on commercials, or maybe a ledger in and small feeder fishing on rivers, that's going to be an absolute dream of a rod. And then finally I've got a more powerful 12-foot version feeder rod. So obviously this is a rod where you need to be casting heavier feeders, maybe up to 3 ounce. So 3 ounce on the rivers, or a bigger method feeder on a bigger commercial or reservoir. So as I mentioned, they're a very practical range, but you've got to see the actions and feel the performance of these rods. They're very lightweight. We've used a very good quality blank construction using 34-ton carbon, so that's very lightweight but also very strong. And it produces a blank that's very, very slim and also has tremendous power. And you can feel these rods have all got a progressive action, which is what we like nowadays, because we're catching all sorts of fish. We're catching small fish and big fish. So that progressive action helps you to play the fish effectively without cracking off on the strike, and also gives you so much power in the butt and the middle section when you're playing the fish. So that's the Agility EXP range of rods. Check them out. I've selected to fish on Woodpecker Lake here at Aldin Grange. Mick, the fishery manager, explained that this is a very prolific mixed species lake. So we've got a variety of fish to target today. We've got a great head of roach and rudd to go for, with some perch. I know there's some big eyed in here, and also some good carp, including mirrors, commons and crucian carp. So it's going to be a really exciting day, and one that I'm really looking forward to. Now I've selected this swim here with this huge bank of lilies. Now lilies always hold fish, but on a day like today it's absolutely blazing hot. And those lilies are going to provide a lot of shade for the fish. It's going to be where they want to be. And I'm hopefully going to be able to encourage them out by regularly feeding and tempt the fish onto the line that I'm fishing. And the method that I'm using today is a very simple Waggler method. Now, Waggler fishing is great. It's great for beginners, pleasure fishermen, in fact all fishermen, and it will enable me to catch a variety of these species very efficiently and very easily. So what I'd like to do first is just have a look at the rig and the tackle that I'm using for Waggler fishing today. Okay, so let's look at the tackle. As I mentioned, I'm using the 11-foot EXP pellet Waggler, which is a great rod on venues like this where you haven't got to cast very far. It's very manageable and it's got a perfect action for catching a variety of different fish. I've teamed it up with this Agility 35 front drag reel, which again balances the whole outfit perfectly. And the reel that I'm using is, reel line rather, is this 4-pound Trilene XL float. One thing to point out is that I've loaded the reel so that the line is almost to the brim of the spool. That's a really key thing to think about when you're spooling your reel up. It means that you'll be able to cast efficiently and effectively. If you don't put enough line on, there's too much friction and you won't be able to cast smoothly with a nice delicate float. So moving on to the floats, as we mentioned, we call them Wagglers, and that's essentially because they're attached bottom end only and they waggle on the line. And as with anything, particularly fishing, I mean, it's a complicated mass of different floats varieties available in the shops. As with everything, it's nice to keep everything simple. And I'll just explain to you very quickly about the different types of Wagglers that we've got. So the first sort of classification to think about is the difference between a loaded float and an unweighted float. So in this case, that's a straight peacock Waggler with no capacity built into the float. And that's got a capacity of 5 AA. And then I've got this Drennan loaded Waggler here that's actually got a weight built into the float. So there's different advantages for using a weighted float over a unweighted float and vice versa. So that's another thing to look at when we're looking at that in more detail. Another thing that you'll see straight away is some of the floats have got what we call an insert and some of them are just straight. So you've got different diameters of floats, and that's really all relating to the different baits that you're using and what you want to achieve with that float. Today we're going to be fishing mainly with simple baits like maggots and casters, so I'm going to plumb for a insert float because they give me greater sensitivity. So it means that when I get a bite, I can spot the bite easier and I can read the bites better. And you'll also notice that some floats are a clear design like these, and other ones are made from solid materials like these peacocks. And I think a great advantage when you're fishing on a venue like this, and when we're going to be fishing what we say up in the water, crystal floats, these clear floats, are a great advantage because I believe that they're less visible to the fish. They're not going to spook the fish so much. One final thing to say about these Drennan insert Wagglers is a great feature, especially for me because I'm actually colourblind, is I can change the inserts between the different floats that I've got to suit the different conditions. So sometimes when the water's clear like this, a light colour, a black float, strange enough, will show up better. Other times when you're fishing against vegetation or lilies, an orange or a yellow tip will show up. So that just gives me great flexibility on the tips that I'm using. Okay, so that's a very brief explanation about the different types of Waggler floats. I just want to show you the rig. And to be honest, it couldn't be simpler today. One thing I am using is a quick change adapter on the float, which I always like to do, so that I can change the float if I break the float, or if I need to change the capacity of the float, so go bigger or smaller. It means I can change the float very rapidly without having to break the whole rig down. Okay, and the float that I've selected today is 1.5 AA. So that's the capacity of the float. It's actually quite a small float, a compact float. I don't need to cast a long way. I'm only going to be casting maybe 10 metres out to buy those reeds, maybe even closer as the day progresses. So I don't need a float with a big capacity. It means that I'm going to be able to cast and not make too much disturbance by having a big splash from a big float. And the short nature of the float as well will help me, because today I just know with these hot conditions I'm going to be catching up in the water. So the fish are going to be intercepting the bait higher in the water, not necessarily on the bottom. What's important to think about when you're waggler fishing is the actual shotting pattern. And you'll notice that I've got most of the bulk shot, what we call bulk shot, situated around the actual float. So that basically gives me my casting weight, and I've got 2 BB shot here with a couple of number 6s and a couple of number 8 shot either side. Now the reason I've done that instead of perhaps just putting 2 big shot in is I want to have the flexibility within that capacity to move shot down, drop a shot down if I need to go deeper, or in fact move shot up close to the float if I want to make the bait fall very slowly through the water. So that's why I have the flexibility of some big shot and some small shot. And another thing to mention, you'll see when I'm fishing, I actually what we call dot the float right down. So that it means that the float is as sensitive as possible, so any slight movement from the fish is reflected on the float. You see a lot of beginners and pleasure fishermen leaving a lot of float proud of the water. And okay, you'll see bites, you'll catch fish, but you'll miss a hell of a lot of bites. So that's why we like to balance the float perfectly with all those trim shot to get it so that it's little, almost a pimple, just so you can see it. You'll catch a lot more fish. So as I mentioned, to start with, I'm going to try and fish up in the water, so I'm actually going to just have 1 number 10 shot down the line. I might actually make it shallower and not have any shot down the line to start with. On other occasions, maybe when it's not as warm and I'm fishing nearer the bottom, I'm going to have to increase the depth of the float and pull some more shot down into play. You'll notice that I'm actually using a hook length. Now, we use hook lengths for most types of fishing for a couple of reasons really. The most important is that it's actually a lower breaking strain and diameter than the reel line. So if I hook a snag like the far bank or something underwater, that's going to break first, so I'm only going to lose that short section of line, not my float and everything else. And also same goes if I hook a big fish and it breaks the line, instead of trailing all the rig around with it, it's only going to trail that small amount of line. So that's why I use a hook length, and you can get hook lengths pre-tied like these from Drennan. They're absolutely fantastic in a variety of sizes and patterns to suit all different types of fishing. So for beginners and pleasure fishermen, I think you can't go wrong with good quality hooks to nylon. Okay, and just finally to mention what I'm using today, I'm actually using an 18 barbless hook to a 2 pound hook length. So the hook length is 2 pound and the reel line is 4 pound. So what could be simpler than that? Let's have a look at how I'm going to feed it and where I'm going to fish in the swim, and then we'll actually get stuck in and hopefully catch some fish. Okay, so as I mentioned in the introduction, I'm fishing next to this fantastic cover of these lilies. And what I'm doing is I'm gradually feeding very regularly 10 to 20 maggots around about 1 metre from those lilies and perhaps 10 metres out from the bank. And already I've got fish feeding on the surface. And one of the biggest mistakes you see people doing, particularly on prolific venues like this, is just simply not feeding enough. I don't think you can really feed regularly enough to get the fish feeding up in the water like this. So what I'm actually doing is casting a little bit past that feed, which means I can sink the line, and it also means I can bring the float right into the middle of where those fish are feeding. So straight away there I've got a bite and I've got a fish. So that just shows you exactly what I mean. I've caught that fish probably only just under the surface, almost immediately, by pulling it back into the feed. I've actually started off with this 18 hook, just using a single maggot. And I think it's important to get into almost like a rhythm when you're fishing. So I'll actually feed into the area, cast out past that area, and then, like I say, reel it back in and then feed again. So because I'm not having to feed very far out, I can actually throw the bait very accurately. Obviously, if I was having to fish a bit further out, I'd use a catapult to get the bait out. But you can't get much simpler than this. But the biggest thing that you've got to consider is this regular feeding. Just 5, 6, 10 maggots, depending on the response from the fish, and just keep them going in. So I'll just quickly show you how I hook the bait. Just hook it in the flap of skin under the fat end of the maggot and just nick it in. So the maggot stays alive and wriggles, and the hook's perfectly positioned to maximise the hooking of the fish. What I'm also going to do is feed a bit closer in with some casters, just to give me another option. So I've selected this area just between some lilies where I can just very conveniently keep dropping some casters in. Might mean that I'll catch some bigger fish, some different fish by fishing in that way. And of course, using a change bait like that's always a real advantage as well. On another day, I might use some corn or pellets, depending on how the fish are responding. So you'll notice that that light float, that 1.5 AA float, makes very little disturbance when it hits the water. So I'm not spooking the fish. And you'll also be able to see how fine that float is on the surface, so that every little knock and bite I can detect it on that very sensitive tip. So you'll notice that when I'm casting and casting past the feed, I'm actually putting my rod tip under the water and reeling. And what that does is it sinks the line. And that's really important because even on today, a blazing hot day like today, there's actually a breeze that's causing a skim on the surface. And if I'm not careful, that'll blow the float unnaturally. So I probably won't get so many bites. So by sinking the line and keeping it under the water, I actually keep the float very, very stable. Now I'm missing bites, so I'm going to adjust the float depth and I'm going to make it a little bit shallower. And I'm actually going to pull that number 10 shot up under the float. So I'm actually fishing with no shot down the line. So we'll see if that makes any difference. So cast past, sink the line, and I'm right in the zone where the fish are feeding. I'm getting lots of knocks and line bites off the fish, and I'm just waiting for the float to be a bit more of a positive bite. Hopefully we'll get one. And if I don't, I'll just twitch the float and feed again. So I'm recreating that fall of bait through the water. So I was missing a lot of bites after adjusting my rig countless times. I've changed down to a size 20 and I've had 2 fish in 2 casts. So it just shows you've got to keep changing your rig and changing your tackle to ensure that you hit bites, particularly on a bright day like this when the sun's up and it's the middle of the day. Well, I'm about an hour into this session now, and all the hard work of constantly feeding little and often is really starting to pay off. I'm catching some fantastic eyed, up to about 1.5 pounds, and I've also caught some nice rudd, roach and some crucian carp. It really is enjoyable fishing. All catching shallow on the Waggler, no less than a foot deep. The great advantage of having 2 lines going at once is that I can rest the main swim every so often. And so let's have a little look on that inside line with a caster and see if there's anything feeding down close in. It's amazing what you can catch down the margins on commercials like this. Sometimes the biggest fish, the biggest carp and tench, particularly later on in the evening, will move into the margins and start feeding. So it's a great idea to feed a swim in that area. And that's a nice hide. So it's always a good idea to feed at least 2 swims, so you can rest one swim and then maybe sneak a nice fish like that. So I'm finding that I'm getting most bites around about just fishing a foot deep with no shot down the line. But another critical thing to think about is the sharpness of your hook, because as soon as it starts to go blunt and you struggle hooking the maggot, you've got to change it, and you'll see a massive difference in the amount of bites that you hit. So I've just changed to a fresh hook, and hopefully that will help me hit more bites. The timing of the strikes are a real art. On days like this, when you're getting bites almost immediately, you've got to differentiate the bites from the line bites. So what I'm looking for is a slightly more positive bite, rather than trying to strike at every little knock. Another thing that you'll notice I'm doing is when I do strike, I'm keeping the rod low so that the float doesn't come flying out the water, something that can happen when you're fishing as shallow as this. So a nice low strike to the water is enough to set the hook, and it keeps the rod in a great position to get a good bend in the rod to play the fish, and also prevent the fish from splashing too much. If you strike up, you can create a big splash that might spook the other fish. Okay, there's another ride, and I think that concludes the session. I reckon I've had around about 20 pounder mixed bag of these eyed. I've had some nice rudd and roach and some nice crucian carp as well. So it just goes to show what a devastating method the Waggler can be. And as I've emphasised throughout the video, how important it is to keep feeding little often, keep casting, keep adjusting the depth. It's been so critical today. Keep adjusting the hooks. It's a busy method, but an absolutely awesome method. And what a fantastic venue as well. I've really enjoyed today. So thanks for watching. If you've got any questions, please don't hesitate to drop me an email. Thanks again. Cheers.